Hey everyone, welcome to week 9. Want to spend this video with a few comments on the working papers and thinking about how to move from that assignment to the advanced interpretive paper on the same passage, which you'll be submitting at the end of this week for your assigned partner to review. Then I want to spend a few moments introducing the stretch of Matthew that we're going to be studying this week, the last of Jesus's 5 discourses in the gospel, often called the Olivet Discourse because of the location where Jesus delivers this discourse, the Mount of Olives. But first of all, the interpretive working papers and moving to your advanced interpretive paper. So the task here is to be able to take the sort of study of the passage that you have completed for your working paper and to now develop that into a single running argument for your interpretation of the passage as a whole. Key to this is your ability to sort of understand the passage coherently so that all of its parts contribute to a kind of driving thrust. One of the challenges that I think many of us had in the interpretive working paper, and it's probably something that we inherit from commentaries and other kinds of sort of patterns of study of our time, is the tendency to make observations or point out interesting details that don't necessarily lead anywhere, that don't contribute something clear to the meaning of the passage or a particular part of it. So that's especially important for this next assignment because the point here is to deliver a consistent interpretation of the whole of the passage so that all of the parts are contributing to that sense of the whole. So just be on the lookout for the need to always have direction with what you introduce about the passage, being clear about what it contributes to the meaning of a particular part of the passage or the whole of the passage. In order to sustain a single interpretive argument, it will be important for you to divide the paper into sections, chunks as it were, and this is crucial to your ability to integrate the different parts of the passage. If you take the passage verse by verse, then you will end up with meaning fragments. You'll start to try to explain something that's sort of bounded by a verse but whose meaning depends on the larger chunk of which it's a part that might be 3 verses or 4 verses. So you got to think about how to present your passage as a whole according to its constituent chunks and to then deal with the details in terms of how they relate to those parts and how those parts relate to the whole. So think of that in terms of the way you organize your paper. You're welcome to dial in on Friday morning during the office hours 10 to 11 if you want to discuss that with me further. Okay, so now moving to the passage that we have for this week, the Olivet Discourse. Just want to be upfront with you that my interpretation of this passage is not very conventional. It's kind of weird because I think that the tendency to read this passage as about a sort of a photograph of the end of the world or even about the second coming of Christ is not a good interpretation. And I want to explain why just to sort of get our discussion going here in this video. The main concerns that govern my interpretation of the passage and that lead me to question a variety of traditional interpretations, not all of them by the way, but many of them, uh, is first of all the place of this discourse in the narrative of Matthew. My sense, as with so many other parts of Matthew, is that a lot of interpretations sort of seize upon certain words or moments in the story without taking into account how they fit into the larger story, how they fit into the arc of the narrative of Matthew. And so, for example, in this case, Jesus has not been telling his disciples that they're going towards Jerusalem for the end of the world. He's been talking about a particular change in kingdom, regime change, that is about to unfold in Jerusalem through his death, as well as his resurrection, and then the whole future that this is going to give rise to, which we find in this discourse is going to include a catastrophic fall of the central edifice and institution of the order of Israel's life, and by extension the life of other peoples around Israel and amidst Israel. And this is going to happen, he says, within a generation. So the arc of the narrative and how Jesus' words fit in that arc are, I think, crucial to a sound interpretation of these words. Secondly, as you've probably guessed from other parts of the class, I think that we tend to interpret Matthew without adequate rooting in the Old Testament, which is to say adequate rooting in the canon of Scripture. And so we tend to attribute to certain words meanings that are oblivious to what those words mean in their Old Testament context, and therefore what they might mean in the tradition of the law and the prophets as Jesus is drawing on them in the Gospel according to Matthew. For example, Jesus is going to talk about the stars falling from the sky in the middle of this discourse. But of course he's quoting Isaiah 13 primarily, which is about the fall of Babylon. And it's not primarily a picture of astronomical phenomena. It is a description of the fall of great powers whose influence has been felt across the known world. So again, I think taking the context of the Old Testament seriously for how we interpret words that Jesus uses, especially when he's quoting from the Old Testament, but then the whole sort of sensibility that that gives to his words is very important, I think, for a sound interpretation of this passage. This is also going to go for the coming of the Son of Man. That triggers in many of our minds immediately the sort of imagination that we have about the second coming. That's a doctrine that I affirm, believe in the return of Christ, but I don't think that this passage is directly about it. And I think that a close study of the Gospel according to Matthew bears that out, especially if we take into account Old Testament context, in this case like that of Daniel 7, which is the vision of the coming of the Son of Man that we've already been working with in the class. So that's crucial. I hope you'll take those considerations into account as you study this discourse. One more comment about the position of this discourse. Obviously, it comes as a kind of conclusion to this intense conflict that Jesus has had with the authorities of his people in the temple courts, and that's crucial to its meaning. But it's also immediately before Jesus goes to what he has been preparing his disciples for as they've been approaching Jerusalem, which is his being handed over by the chief priests and the elders of his people to the Gentile authority to be crucified, to be tortured as an insurgent king who refuses to submit to Roman authority. So there is an intimate connection between the future that Jesus predicts for the temple and Jerusalem and the future of his own body. The narrative itself has structured that for us so that we will be attentive to the many connections that there are between those two parts of really what is one event that I might describe as the coming of the Son of Man to power, to rule. So don't miss the intimacy between the fall of Jesus and the fall of the temple. And the circumstances that lead to those falls are actually quite similar. And Jesus bears this out in the discourse that we're studying. He makes it clear that the temple is going to fall as a consequence of Jewish civil war that will be absolutely atrocious in its consequences for the people, especially the weakest of the people, and it is finally part of an invasion by Roman power. And that is what happens to his body. Infighting among his people is what leads to his being handed over to Roman power. So we want to take these parallels into account, not least because they've been structured into the presentation of Matthew's gospel narrative. I hope that all of this will make you reflect with some patience on what is at stake in these matters. And I've invited you to perhaps include some of those reflections in your post to Response Forum 2. I think the way that Christians have imagined the future, especially when we think of it as the end of the world, and use the Bible to do that, have not been very healthy for the way that Christians live in the world. So there's a lot to learn from this passage, and how the fall of the temple in relation to the fall of Jesus' body should govern our understanding of the life that we're living and how we are living into the future that God is working out through our lives. So there's a lot at stake, not just in terms of how you interpret Matthew, but how we understand life, how we understand the flow of time, what we understand to be the shaping of the world that God has created through this people Israel that calls out to this God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which has grown in number immensely over the course of its life to embrace people from east and west now calling out to this God as their own, all through the memory and the presence for the last 2,000 years of this person, Jesus, presented to us as the Messiah, the last king of Israel that inherits all the peoples of the world. This is a heavy week coming up for you, and I want to just acknowledge that. Going in, you've got a lot of work on your plate. Obviously, there's interpretive work on this discourse, a couple of forums to work through. There's quite a bit of reading in addition to the Josephus material that I hope will enhance your sense of the catastrophic nature of the fall of the temple and all that it meant for the world, adding to what we read from Cohen last week. You're also going to be invited to read an article of mine called The Ethical Burden of Hell, a retrieval of Gehenna, Hades, and eternal fire. Some of us have spoken about this material earlier in the class, so this is now a little more detailed treatment of it. I would say that since your time is obviously limited and you're trying to complete a draft of your advanced interpretive paper, that you might spend a little less time in the commentaries this week, sort of parachute into them where you want to focus on certain matters and concentrate that on the questions that you're answering in Forum 1, and then be sure to give adequate time to Josephus as a primary source, and then this article of mine on this sort of thorny question of hell for this week. Josephus, just a final word about that. Key source for us, but he's not the Bible. He writes his account, especially if you read the whole thing, the whole account of the Jewish war, with a significant measure of partisan interest, I would say. But my purpose in assigning the last part of the Jewish war narrative that he gives is for you to gain more than just a museum-like appreciation of the Jewish Civil War and its culmination with the Roman siege of Jerusalem and the horrors that that involved. Because I think a museum-like uh, study of that event is partly what has made us basically completely overlook the immense weight attributed to it in the New Testament and therefore its meaning for what it means to be Christian. So hopefully Josephus will give you some sense of the intense drama of the fall of the temple and what was involved in that for the generation that lived through it, but especially the generations that have been picking up the pieces ever since. God bless you this week. Hope you find the study rich.